Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. My name is Ryan Painter, and I'm really excited to have here the host of Nuanced. You know him, you love him, Aaron Pete. Aaron is the host of Nuanced, and he is also a podcaster. He's bringing fresh perspectives, really interestingly curious perspectives. Talks about his upbringing. He talks about his world as a chief of a local First Nation and also a former elected councillor of the Chawathel First Nation. But I think it's also interesting because Pete comes with a perspective that isn't necessarily one side or the other. My sense of things is he really does try to bridge divides. And so I wanted to bring him on the show today to talk about the issues that he tackles, the issues we're tackling as a society today, and get his perspective. Aaron, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Aaron, first off, I just want to start. The Nuance podcast wasn't actually the first podcast. You actually started with Bigger Than Me to Nuance. Like it was Bigger Than Me first. Am I correct? Is that how you started?
Yeah, so I started in 2020. I was in my law degree at Allard School of Law at UBC, and we had just shut down because of the pandemic. And I thought it would be a great opportunity to start exploring ideas. I don't know who my father is, and my mother was born with fetal alcohol syndrome disorder. So I feel like I lacked a lot of role models growing up. And I had always heard like, oh, invite people you want to learn from for coffee. And that didn't really feel like me. But starting a podcast and speaking with people who do think bigger than themselves was the roots of that. I did that for several years. And in 2025, I changed the name from Bigger Than Me podcast to Nuanced because I felt like I had a good understanding of the issues, or I had at least heard from a lot of different perspectives and started to ground myself. A lot of the comments I had received during Bigger Than Me was, we'd like to hear your voice and what is your perspective? And that's when I started to change the direction. I also just felt like there were people I didn't consider perhaps role models or admirable people, but I wanted to understand how they came to their positions. And I've always loved the idea of steel manning positions and hearing the best argument of something you completely disagree with. That's something that's always fascinated me. And so I changed the name to Nuanced, trying to see, even in somebody's opinion you might disagree with, if there's a nugget or if there's information there that would be good for you to have.
You talk about starting this with Rebecca. Rebecca is your partner. Is that right?
Yes, she's my fiance.
Fiance, congratulations. As someone who was a fiance for 10 years before I finally got married, I hope it doesn't take you that long, but it takes as long as it's going to take. What does she think about this? Because you've definitely gained what I think can rightly be said is a great deal of respect in the podcasting community, the commentary community, the political community, because of how you approach things. And I actually think nuanced is a great way to describe it. What does she think about all that's kind of happening with you and where this is taken?
She's been on the journey since day one when I started looking at creating a podcast space to interview people. That was $2,000 when I was a student and we didn't have a lot of money coming in and we were relying on student loans and stuff. And so it was a big ask at the time, but she backed me. She backed the idea. She knew that both of us came from households that didn't have people who were doctors, lawyers, people who you could learn a lot from, even if you might not want to take the same path. We just both didn't have that. And so she saw the value in it. She's been the social media creator behind it since the beginning, and she's walked alongside me as we've done each interview. And she saw the challenge I had with wanting to hear from people I disagree with, but in a thoughtful and respectful way. And so she was the one who supported with the branding and made sure that it all looked professional and that it all had good social media style.
Oh, well, it does look great. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, your lighting is obviously better than mine. So congratulations on that. My lighting is in my house. You do what you can with what you got, but it looks great. Wanted to say nuanced is how you come out this work. You do try to bridge divides, bring people together, but you put yourself in positions where you have discussions with people who you probably generally wouldn't agree. Number one, why are you putting yourself in that place to challenge orthodoxy? Is it because you want to challenge your perspectives, or is it because you're strident in yours and you want to challenge others, or is it a bit of both, or is it neither?
I would, I guess, the cop out answer would be it's a bit of both, but I would say more the first one. I I don't I don't know if other people just come naturally to their opinions, but I see, like, when I look at conservative or NDP, I see value to both. I see arguments on both sides that we do need to take care of the vulnerable. We do need to be mindful that this can be a game where people lose and there's no pathway back to success if we're not careful, and that we do have to be mindful of those social challenges people face. But at the same time, we can't have a victim mentality. We have to make sure that when people are facing challenges, that they themselves rise to the occasion, that they do pull up their bootstraps. Now, do I think that there can be like a step towards us supporting them if they're going to pull up their bootstraps? Absolutely. And that's where I hear both arguments and I see validity, and I find myself often trying to struggle with, it can't be either or. It has to be both in so many of these circumstances. And I also look at the longevity. People say, I voted for this person, they didn't get voted in, and that means that my vote didn't matter. Well, it indicated to the party that got elected that there was strength in that argument, and there was a case to be made there. And I think you see that broadly, particularly with the NDP government right now. Lots of people do not like the NDP government. I'm sure lots of people listening don't like the NDP government, but doesn't it say something that the Conservatives have been able to move the needle on issues to the point that the NDP have had to walk back some of their policies? Doesn't that show that a democratic system where not only at the ballot box are people having their voices heard, that it is through general sentiment within communities? And I find that all really interesting. And I don't feel like one party represents me. And I don't think most people should feel that way. I think you should look at the issues and where we are and try and make an informed decision and push both parties to do better and act on British Columbians or Canadians' behalf.
Well, I think you raise a really good point there about, generally speaking, people should be willing to have conversations and test their perceptions, test their ideas. You don't get a lot of that in politics these days. There is a lot of tribalism in politics because people, I mean, there's a general sense, I think, in psychology that people like to be with who they most agree with, and that makes them feel comfortable. They're accepted. And I think politics really does drive that to the extreme in many ways, where it really kind of enforces this mentality where everyone has to agree, we have to say the same thing, we all have to kind of move in the same direction, and we can't show any kind of external animosity or contrarian perspectives or opinions. I wonder, in your opinion, are we, because politics is divided, and I think we've been saying that for years, I don't think it's trite to say it because I think it's just true. Do you think that we are getting to a place where people are kind of giving up a little bit on politics because it's so divided and because of that kind of that tribalistic nature? Or would you say that it's just kind of always been this way?
No, I don't think it's always been this way. I think what's really interesting from my perspective is the absolute change of the media landscape from the CBC, Global News, CTV towards what we're doing here today, because it does give Canadians who didn't feel like their voice was being represented on those shows or the concerns they had a real voice. And I look at the success of so many YouTube channels, and one that stands out to me the most that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about is this Moose on the Loose, and how he just covers topics, and he's getting 100,000 views on episodes he posts within hours of posting them. And that really does signal that there was a piece missing in our media landscape, and people are frustrated and they feel unheard, and they're going to places where their voices are being heard and being listened to. And I think that's the change I'm seeing. I'm not seeing hopelessness or a sense of giving up. I'm seeing a lot of people going, I'm going to go find the person who's going to inform me. And you mentioned before we started the Sam Cooper interview. I'm blown away by how fast that interview has blown up, the reaction to it, and how relieved people feel, because I don't feel like this is being as covered on mainstream news as it is being covered on independent media. And I do think that this is going to change how we do things. I mean, in 2024, just to wrap up this point, that was the first time where I saw the provincial government do a podcast tour. All political parties looked at podcasts as the pathway forward. I thought we were going to see that in 2025 with the election. I had kind of bet on that, and I was completely wrong. They all stopped their media tours in the same way, and they held to their talking points. I think that that was a huge error on all the parties that chose to do that. And I think the pathway forward now, and what I heard in all of my interviews with those candidates and with listeners, was I just want to hear somebody talk for an hour and hear what their thoughts are and see how they arrive at what they think. You might not agree with them. Lots of people did not like my interview with David Eby in terms of his policy prescriptions. but they appreciated being able to hear the man explain himself and how he arrived at where he was. And I think that's the piece that's missing. There's so much simple things that we can ask politicians that just give us an understanding of where they're coming from.
I want to just go back to the piece around the media landscape because just after the federal CPC convention, where Pierre Poilievre was having a vote on his leadership, he received 87.4%. You assessed correctly that there was very much leading up to that a narrative arc structured in the mainstream media for sure that Poilievre was in trouble. And you posted, I'll confess something. I think we just went through a propaganda storm. Based on all the commentary and polling on mainstream news, I was expecting maybe between 50 and 70%. There were a lot of people saying Pierre was finished in my friend group on news networks. Does he have a lot of areas to improve? Absolutely. But if you saw any data last week, it looked horrible. Now all those trends appear to be reversing. That's odd. And if you can't admit that it's at least strange, the timing of this, then you'll need some very strong evidence. What were you thinking when you posted that? I mean, it's pretty clear in your words, but I'm wondering if we can dissect that a little bit because it almost sounds like you're intimating that there was a narrative being forcefully put out there for a reason.
I think that's indisputable if you just look at the coverage. I consumed the coverage. I was interested in what I was being told, and it was all inaccurate. It was not reflective, and all of the polls that they had shown us all reversed back to where they were right after the leadership convention or in and around the same time. I mean, I interviewed David Coletto, and I have great respect for the man, but his polls were showing that Pierre was absolutely tanking over the week before the convention. Is that a coincidence? I just don't think so. I'm just not convinced of that across all of the polling information they were receiving. And I think that there was a narrative very consistently that Pierre's not likable, that he's not friendly enough, that he just cannot get people to wrap around it. I looked at the interviews over the Christmas break with, I believe it was Donna Friesen at Global News, and it was just an attack. It was just a nonstop interrupting and arguing against him. And then you watch the Carney one, and it's completely different. The tone is different. The patience. Now, some will argue, well, Pierre sets himself up for that because he's disagreeable by nature. And so journalists want to show him that's not what they're there to do. In my humble opinion, their job is not to make Pierre look as silly as the person who is, while he was eating the apple that he made look bad. Like, that's not their job. And if you're going there to do that, I don't think you're participating in journalism by my definition. You might have your own version of that, but I think when you watch those things and you're being told something and it turns out to be completely misguided, I think you have a right to go, why were you doing this? What was the reason? And was there incentives in place? And then we talk about how these organizations are funded and who's talking about wanting to defund our media landscape. And you wonder, is this a factor? I think in any other circumstance, you'd go, yeah, there's probably a factor here of incentives taking place. And I don't think that that should be as disputed. And I think Canadians are frustrated because we're trying to understand what's going on and make informed decisions. And it just feels like we're intentionally being dragged down paths that are not accurate. And that doesn't mean I endorse Pierre Poilievre or think he's got all the answers, or I think Mark Carney's got all the answers. I'm skeptical of both leaders. I'm skeptical of politicians. In the 90s, that was normal that you would question whether or not politicians were in it for the right reasons and doing right by you. I'm just saying, if you look at that case, you have a lot of questions about why it was covered the way it was and who was to gain from that. And to me, the media who are subsidized had something to gain in that.
And I think that goes a long way to really driving home why so many conservatives want to defund the CBC. Look, it was someone who grew up with the CBC. I can recall going back and forth to university, listening to CBC with my wife. We would drive from Vernon to Kelowna, go to UBC Okanagan. We'd listen to The Current with Anna Maria Tremonti. We would listen to Af Canada because that was playing at the time, and we were in the app. I mean, I'm dating myself now, so and it was an important part of our day. And now I look at what I see with David Cochrane or any number of CBC commentators and Rosemary Barton too. Both of them, the way they go after whether it's Danielle Smith, whether it's Michelle Repple Garner, it doesn't matter who it is. The language that they use is so clearly torqued in favor of a narrative that supports the government. it is really difficult to watch that from my perspective and see that they've not already established a narrative and then they are using their publicly paid positions to support it. What do you think?
Well, first, I'd say I'd go to principles. My principle would be that journalists should be harder on the government than they are on the official opposition. Why? Because the official government is in control. They have the ability to move forward or not move forward on something. So I don't think any journalist has a duty to argue or articulate the position of the government. That is the law of the land for that day. I don't think we as citizens need to hear from our media why the government thinks what they think, broadly speaking. I don't think if I go on the CBC and go, I don't like that the government's doing this, I don't think the person on the other end has the duty to go, well, they say that they're doing it for all the right reasons. I think the government needs to be scrutinized at all times. And I think the official opposition, their job is to hold the government accountable and prescribe different alternatives to the path going forward. And the reason that they should get a little bit more deference than the government is because we should be skeptical of where our taxpayer dollars are going. And the official opposition has the duty to try and lay out what those other options are. And that's why they need to be given voice and the opportunity to do so. What I see, and in your example, is we see media being harder on the official opposition than they are on the government. And to me, that doesn't make any sense.
Yes, I'll let you grab a drink there and I'll take over for you. I agree with you. It's is weird. It is weird that, and it can only be because, I mean, I hate to steal simplistic arguments because for me, sometimes things probably are just this simple, but I don't know. Is it just because they're getting government funding and they feel their job is to support the government? And because they know I mean, look, the conservatives have said they're going to defund the CBC. The liberals have said they're going to keep funding it. Therefore, the CBC has a clear interest in reporting positively for the government. I mean, that seems pretty basic, doesn't it?
It does. And then I would just tie that into when you have a character like Pierre Poilievre, who can make journalists look bad. Like, I think the Apple one is a clear example. It went viral globally for him making a journalist look bad. I think there becomes a cachet to make him look bad and to try and get the win. And so when I put myself in the shoes of those journalists who did that, I imagine after they do the interview, they want to share it around. Just like when I feel like I have a really interesting interview, I want to share it with my community, the people that I know who know what I do and who like what I do. And I think that there's a premium on trying to get a moment where Pierre looks bad. And what that's
Mm.
resulted in, from my humble perspective, is I really don't know strongly what Pierre actually thinks or what his roots are, because so much of what he does is trying to navigate hostile interviews that I really don't feel like I understand the man behind it. And you get glimpses. I know he's done a few interviews that I thought were really interesting, but he's so guarded now. The man behind it isn't coming out as clearly as I'd like to understand, because he's speaking for at least 40% of the population. We need to know what this individual thinks, unguarded and honest. And just one example of that I spoke to Sam Cooper about that was really frustrating. He criticized the RCMP. I think the RCMP are not above criticism. How many people think that the government is at least at times corrupt and doesn't act on behalf of the people? I mean, 5%, 10%, if the number's not zero. And so the RCMP is not going after politicians. We haven't seen a political arrest in a very long time. I think that breeds mistrust to a certain extent. Why don't they go after the government? Why don't they look into those things? Because their careers, their reflection, the RCMP looking unbiased is what they're trying to protect. And I think that does at times result in them not being as objective and as aggressive in the pursuit of truth and justice as it should be. Pierre pointed that out, and the media backlash to that was shocking. As somebody with a criminology degree who knows RCMP officers, there's no dispute when you speak to those frontline officers that they're doing important work. But they'll all tell you that the senior leadership at the very top of the heap, they're not worried about exactly what crime is going on the front lines. They're long past that. They are career politicians in a lot of those positions and are disconnected from how safety feels when you're in a marginalized community or in a downtrodden community. And that's what Pierre was pointing to. These people are all politicians just like us. And the reaction shows that that was not well received in Ottawa and amongst those individuals.
I want to, for the last 10 minutes or so that we've got you here, I want to talk about DRIPA and the Cowichan decision and where we've landed in reconciliation, not just in British Columbia, but in Canada. And I ask you this not just because you're a chief, but you're a commentator who I think has brought some really interesting nuance to this conversation. Sometimes I don't even know where to start on this, and I can't imagine it's any easier for you. But we're in a place now in 2026 where we're looking back several years and thinking, what was seemingly a positive moment in the passing of Drippa, in the advancement of reconciliation, and in the ideas that BC is heading in a direction where we're going to have some cooperation between Indigenous leadership, Indigenous communities, whether they be hereditary or elected, and economic development, economic prosperity, and a pathway forward. It now feels with the Cowichan decision specifically, which is relating back to DRIPA and the Interpretation Act, that we're in some ways slowly and in some ways very quickly marching backwards, and it's difficult to tie this all in 9 to 10 minutes. But I wonder if you can just help us situate ourselves in 2026. Where are we with reconciliation and with moving forward with that? Because many people who I talk to, Aaron, they tell me, like, yes, we understand that Canada has issues in the past. We don't deny that. But for goodness sakes, why do we have to keep looking backwards? And why do I have to keep being blamed for it when I didn't do anything?
That's a really important question, a complicated one to answer. I guess I would just start by zooming out and saying, for almost all of Canada's history, Indigenous people were treated like a footnote. And I don't think that's disputed. And if we're going to dispute that, I don't think we're going to get very far in a conversation. And so from, I would say, the 2000s, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People happened in the 90s. It didn't get a lot of press. Then that 2015 Truth and Reconciliation comes out. Justin Trudeau talks about it. He makes it a core mandate of his to push forward on. I think the NDP did a very similar thing. And I would just look at this like the pendulum swung from Aboriginal people are a footnote when we tried to get added to the Constitution, that we had to send a whole train and a whole convoy over just to be recognized. And so that pendulum swung all the way up until, I would say, in the mid 2022, 23, that pendulum was fully over and you could do no wrong by continuing to push forward. It was never going to be enough. Keep moving. There's no end sight. And what's really interesting is you see, I think, particularly for the Conservative Party now, a lot of the people who were BC Liberals supported what was DRIPA and this process. And I think it again just speaks to the importance of the official opposition. They shouldn't have supported it at the time, not because it was bad legislation, but because it's their job not to. It's their duty to the Crown and to British Columbians not to support those things, to offer different alternatives at the time. And they didn't. And they didn't because we were all on the same page that this issue was not cared for in the way that it needed to. But what you end up with when they don't offer different policy prescriptions is everybody betting everything on one policy prescription. And there was no disagreement. There was no debate about this. And so we moved forward with it. And I don't think DRIPA is the root of these issues. I know a lot of candidates in the BC Conservative Party are focused on repealing it, and good luck to them. I just don't think, I think if they're going to bet it on that and they're going to tell British Columbians, I'm going to fix this via that policy prescription, I just don't think they understand the Cowichan decision. I don't think they understand the roots of where this is coming from. And I don't think it's going to bring the result the British Columbians are expecting if you repeal DRIPA. I think a lot of people think DRIPA is the root of the Cowichan decision. It was a factor. It's not the whole enchilada. I think a lot of people have questions about the unmarked grave story. That has nothing to do with DRIPA. I don't see the argument as to that being the root. Now, like those Conservative Party members are going to respond to me and go, well, we've got to start somewhere. And it's like, but if you start on the wrong policy prescription and British Columbians expect you to deliver the results that they think you've got up your sleeve, I don't think you're going to deliver what you're promising them. And I don't think that that's a really strong plan. Repealing something is governments do it all the time. That's not really a path forward. What I see as the path forward is, one, I'll just identify the issue. I don't see reconciliation as an endless thing that we can do forever. I think British Columbians and Canadians rightly go, we would like to see this issue addressed. And my goodness, we used to be a country that did big things. We used to build railways. We used to build highways across Canada. We used to do things that were wonders to the world. Healthcare across Canada made sure everybody has access to it. We used to think big and we used to address the problem. And I don't agree with anybody who says reconciliation needs to be a forever thing and people need to feel bad about everything forever. I just don't think that that's something I want to get on board with. I don't think it's something that First Nations want. They, like, when I speak to members, they don't want to be in poverty. They want to make a good living, and they want to make a good living so they can provide for their kids and leave something for the next generation, like every other British Columbian Canadian. And when we start focusing on, well, is it DRIPA or is it this policy? I think that that's a losing argument. British Columbians were sympathetic because they knew that First Nations were placed behind the eight ball since birth. Because my circumstance was my grandmother went to St. Mary's Indian Residential School. She was traumatized. She drank. My mother was born with FASD as a consequence of that drinking. Now I'm here. The goal is to try and reverse all of that, not only for me and my children, but for my community. So everybody has a shot at making a difference, at reaching their full potential, at being a person you can be proud of and wins awards for making a difference in their communities. I think everybody wants that. We don't have that. We have a reserve system that does still put people in more vulnerable circumstances. We have communities that are not receiving the support. We have corrupt leaders on First Nation land that don't operate properly. We have lots of problems that still put First Nations and Indigenous people behind the eight ball. And I don't want that for anybody. And when you hear the Ellis Ross and others, their whole focus is we can't have sexual abuse on reserves. We can't have people living in abject poverty the rest of their lives. We need to address those issues. And I think British Columbians, they're not lost on that needing to be addressed and knowing that First Nations do start behind the eight ball, whether it's their parents with fetal alcohol syndrome disorder or experiences in residential school. The question is, how do we address those real issues? And to me, I think the NDP lost the plot because they're focused on these Indigenous justice centres, and I just don't feel that that's where we're going to address these systemic issues on reserve. I think the BC housing being built on reserve, which my community is benefiting from, will address some of the housing problems that First Nation communities have. It will be the first time these BC housing projects where housing is built to provincial standard. We have basements that were unfinished, mold, mildew, the worst. Everybody's driven past a reserve and seen the living conditions at times and knows that that's not acceptable. That's where I think we can start to address it. We can set benchmarkers on how we get there, on the timelines we're all willing to accept, and then we deliver on it, we celebrate, we move on to the next one. And I think that's my dream path forward. But the last piece I'll say is British Columbians were not properly consulted, in my opinion, with the NDP's direction or the Liberals' direction. And leaving out constituents, members of society, taxpayers was the wrong move from the outset, because then you didn't have anybody pulling back some of the legislation, the reconciliation agreements, and saying, hey, we want to support, but we want to draw fair lines so that this is affordable, cost effective, and accountable. And that's where British Columbians are showing up now and going, we didn't sign up for this. We didn't agree to any of this. And that's not what you told us we were going. And so I think that's where you're seeing a lot of the backlash.
But does that not then justify repealing DRIPA and starting over? I mean, I've certainly heard some of the current Conservative leadership candidates say that, look, a reconciliation in and of itself is something we need to push forward. The NDP did it wrong by trying to move DRIPA forward. They didn't execute properly, and I don't want to bore listeners by getting into the nuances of DRIPA and Cowichan and the Interpretation Act, because honestly, there's lots there and it would take another hour and a half to even dive into any of those individual pieces. But it stands to reason that if the NDP and the Liberals then didn't consult with folks, push through a piece of legislation, which I think you're rightly saying was not properly debated in the House because of the environment we were in at the time, which was a very, if you could say permissive, probably isn't the right word to use, but I think you know what I'm saying. It was a very forgiving way of just saying, let's just move this forward because we just have to do it. Should we not start fresh? Should we not, in this case, throw the baby out with the bathwater and start brand new, repeal DRIPA, start with something that actually has some social license to it?
To be honest with you, I don't care. Like, it's just not the policy. Like, I'm not pro DRIPA or anti DRIPA. I don't really care about this piece of legislation. I also don't agree. Like let's start over because, well, like, what are we gonna do anything with the Indian Act? I feel like that one's kind of an important one. If we're gonna throw this one out, why not that one? Like, how far are we willing to go? And then I guess the only other piece I'd say is, of course, everybody who's a conservative can point to where DRIPA didn't work, but what about all the areas it did? And are you confident that the water is bad, or do you have one case study where it went wrong and you're betting everything that British Columbians don't like the Cowichan ruling, and so that this is going to be the selling point? I don't know. I see a lot of good things and a lot more First Nations involvement in policy decisions as a consequence to DRIPA. I think that that's a good thing overall because it brings in more voices, more perspectives. Does that mean those perspectives are always correct? I don't think so. I don't think any municipality is always correct. I don't think any First Nation community is always correct. But I'm not sold that DRIPA is causing across the board more problems. I think we have two examples where DRIPA came up, and a lot of politicians seeing this is kind of the wedge issue that I can win the day on. But I will just warn them, it may be a trapdoor. You may repeal it, and then what? And end up with something you don't want to repeat it, so you can't go back to that well, but maybe there's something in that well that is actually useful, and you may be throwing it out unnecessarily and missing an opportunity to leverage some good in that legislation to keep First Nations on board and find a different path forward. I'm not for DRIPA or against DRIPA. I just think we need to be strategic and look at the policy as a whole. And right now it feels like politicians are just focusing on the areas in which are big mistakes. But I mean, like, if we look at seatbelt laws, they didn't exist and then they came into effect. So like, it's not always clear that the initial reaction is going to be the correct one.
Yeah. So, very, very interesting thoughts there. I feel like we could go on for this for a while, but I guess my final thoughts on this are, look, like, we need to get to a place, in my opinion, where economic reconciliation for Indigenous communities is prioritized. You said it. And I've been up in Indigenous communities in the North. I've talked to folks there. They want to be able to pay their bills. They want to be able to leave a future for their kids. They want to be healthy, and they want to have strong, vibrant communities. It's like anyone else does. There's really no difference. So the way you make that happen is by giving Indigenous communities control over what they can do with their communities around them, with economic opportunities, with providing them with options to find jobs or to bring in projects. It doesn't matter what it is, like any other community around there, where they can actually negotiate and talk about actually seeing some economic vibrancy and vitality in their communities. And I think, to your point, that's largely for a long time been ignored. There does seem to be some movement going with several of the projects coming forward. I know Carney has his pipeline and this major projects office, and I know Danielle Smith's been talking about working with First Nations folks there too. And David Eby's talked about some renewable energy projects and mining projects, and I know the Tahltan has had some stuff up north with some in their communities as well. So it does seem to like there's things moving forward. I wonder, in your respect, or in your opinion, with respect to all of that, do you think, despite all the kind of negative vibes around DRIPA and Cowichan, do you think, generally speaking, the royal we, are moving in a direction where we're going to get to that end that you said you think you want to see? Because you said, and I think there's broad agreement that there should be an end somehow, like a hard cap to this reconciliation discussion, a place where it says, okay, yes, for lack of a better word, we have achieved reconciliation, right? Like, perhaps I'm being flippant with that, and I'm not trying to, but are we moving in a place where you think we're getting there, and we're seeing that in the near future, in my lifetime, in your lifetime, or is it still several generations off?
I see certain communities setting the scaffolding for a process that would make sure that those ends are met. Soyuz First Nation Chief Clarence Louie, I interviewed him. He talks about the importance of Native work ethic and how you get there, and how economic development is the horse that pulls the social cart. We have, within my region, we have Musqueam, Tsayuwaltooth, Shiacton, Squayala, who are all setting out frameworks for how you can get children out of care, how you can make sure people have economic opportunities and contribute to society in a healthy way. I don't see the results coming from the province or the federal government that are bringing about those results. I see, as you mentioned, Tahltan. They are figuring out the path that's going to work to them. And so I would just say that the government isn't aligned with the First Nations that are really bringing about the change. And if I were in the position of being a politician, I would say you should get all of the First Nation communities that have good socioeconomic outcomes. You get them at a table, you form a committee, and you say, what the hell did you do that was so successful that brought about these results? And how do we codify that into a pathway forward for other First Nation communities? But that also means going into First Nation communities that have very low capacity, very low support systems, and going, how do we walk alongside you? We don't want your members living in these conditions anymore. We are here to help and we are here to support you. We're not here to walk all over you, but we don't want any British Columbian left behind. What do you need from us? How do we walk alongside you on that? And I think that would be the pathway, broadly speaking, forward to me to make sure that the neglect and abuse stops. But I'm not hearing anybody focused on those pieces.
Aaron Peat, host of the Nuanced podcast. Any final thoughts before we let you go to the rest of your day?
Ryan, it was a pleasure chatting with you. I think all of these issues are really complicated, and I appreciate you being willing to invite me on. I guess I would just say to your earlier question, there's a lot of weight on people right now. There's a lot of uncertainty, and there's a sense of hopelessness that I can see at grocery stores when I see people trying to choose things. And it makes me really sad because that's what my community members have been facing for a long time. And poverty in general just makes me really sad. And so to those people, I just hope you know that supporting individuals like Ryan, supporting people who are trying to get word out there and try and put forward ideas is one of many pathways forward. Independent creators, we have a lot of challenges we face trying to run a show and find the time and book the guests and try and succeed, but we're trying to get messages out there that matter to British Columbians, that matter to Canadians. And so that like, that comment, that subscription, that all helps people continue to get their voice out there. It means a lot to them. And so whoever you follow, whoever you're a fan of, just know that you can have an impact on a creator who's trying to get messages out that are really important to British Columbians, Canadians, and people in general. So thank you again, Ryan.
Excellent final message. Thanks a lot, Aaron, and we'll be sure to have you back on in the future. But for now, thanks for all your work. Appreciate it. And I will make sure to put some details about how to get in touch with you and watch your show in the show notes. Thanks again.